Hello all and welcome to our session on taking the idea of place seriously in tackling environmental problems. So you are probably just trickling in from your previous session and fantastic to welcome you here as well. So in this session, we'll be thinking about how place helps us to create effective communications and campaigns to connect people and nature. And in what ways can concepts like place attachment help us to better understand how people respond to change in places and landscapes? And how can we better connect place research and real world action? And so to talk us through that, we're going to hear from Dr. Devine-Wright, who is a professor at the University of Exeter with a primary interest in the social acceptance of energy transitions, community engagement and place attachment. And his expertise spans human geography and environmental psychology, and he was cited in the top 1% of social science scholars globally by the Web of Science from 2019 through to 2022. He's currently the director of the Economic and Social Research Council funded Access project with a leadership team for environmental social science. And he's an IPCC lead author on social aspects of climate mitigation. And I should have said, I'm Dr. Laura Fogg-Rogers. This relates to my research as well. So really interested to hear your talk as well, Patrick. For our participants, if you could, please do chat, introduce yourselves in the chat box at the bottom. And as we go through, please ask any questions in the Q&A function. That's what I will use at the end of Patrick's talk to put your comments and thoughts to Patrick. So please, Patrick, do take it as away and enlighten us. Thank you.
Cheers, Laura. Let me just work out share screen. Okay, can you verify that you can see the screens in front, Laura? All right.
We can indeed, yeah, it's looking fantastic. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'll crack on then. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak, and thanks, Laura, for that kind introduction as well. So as you know, I'm based at the University of Exeter. My name is Patrick Devine-Wright, and I'm talking about place today in relation to environmental problems. And I will talk about the Access project, which I'm the director of, in more detail as well. Yeah, I mean, you've already had a bit of an introduction, so I won't say too much here. But basically, my research has been about conflicts over environmental change. And what introduced me to this area was the whole idea of NIMBYism, the idea that there are kind of troublesome people out there in communities who get in the way of progress. And if we just kind of manage to find ways around that, we could get on with doing the things that are good for society. But I guess I've also been, from an early stage, the kind of academic who isn't really satisfied with just writing up lots of academic journal papers that a handful of people in universities across the world might read, but also to take that out into society and to inform what people in government, what people who are in decision-making positions and wider society can do. So the idea of taking social science out of the academy, out of the ivory tower, sometimes that means sharing good ideas with people, and sometimes it means tackling ideas that we think are not so useful for society. And I would certainly put a lot of the NIMBY discourse in that bracket too. So yeah, that's a brief introduction to me. And on the right-hand side, you've already heard various ways that I've been involved in advisory roles, decision-making roles, and trying to juggle that and just try to make my work in social science more generally impactful in society. And I guess the backdrop to all of this is the environment and climate emergency that we're within, and which particularly exercises me as an academic. Not all academic research needs to be relevant to today's concerns, but if you're interested in environmental research more generally, which I've always been, trained as an environmental psychologist and interested in place, then this context does change everything. It means that we have to consider the relevance of our research, and we can't just talk to ourselves as academics, but we need to engage with wider society. And that is the reason why I'm here today sharing these ideas with you. We live at a time where rapid structural transformation is needed, and that asks enormous questions, not just of academics to get out there and share their findings so that we have evidence which we can use to base decisions upon, but it also asks questions of policymakers and people in decision-making positions all across society to question our current ways of thinking, current ways of doing, and consider the kind of rapid structural, behavioral, institutional changes that we know are necessary, and to do this fast because time is running out. So that's the broader backdrop to the talk. And in terms of a quick summary, I will just introduce what the Access Network is, for those who haven't heard of it. I will go into kind of teaching mode a little bit, so pardon me a little bit on this. I'll just describe what I call some foundational kind of definitions and points, so you can understand where I'm coming from in terms of thinking about place or thinking with place. And then I will describe the output of a recently finished research project, which is about sense of place in the context of net zero and the decarbonization of industry. And I know that's maybe slightly different from the kind of nature interest of many people in this conference, but I think it has broader environmental significance and relevance, and I hope to show that quite soon and then come to some conclusions. I would say also, by the way, that as far as I'm aware, this is recorded. The slides will be available afterwards. Don't panic if there's far too much material on the slides, which is an academic failure that most of us unfortunately find it difficult to get around. So make notes, remember things, get your questions ready for me, but you will access all of this material afterwards, and don't worry about that. So here we go. So starting with Access, I suppose, yes, so this is a 5-year initiative funded by the Economic and Social Research Council that I'm the director of, and I work with other academics and other partners, particularly the University of Surrey. And really, Access starts with the fundamental point that there's loads and loads of really good social science research on environmental problems that's out there. The problem is that most people don't know about it because most people don't read academic journal papers. That's not a surprise, I suppose, but it does raise issues about how we connect up the evidence base and research base on one hand, and the people who need to use it and to be informed by it on the other. And Access is designed to try and cross those sectoral and disciplinary boundaries and enable that through networking and various activities. So the purpose of Access is to kind of fly the flag, to champion and provide leadership on the social science contributions to tackling and solving a range of environmental problems. It's based on the premise that the social sciences, and there are many of those, they include geography, sociology, political science, a whole variety of disciplines, have something useful to offer. And yet often when we think about environmental problems, we go straight to science. We go straight to scientists often. We think about technologies. We think about engineering, solutions. And that's not often the full picture. It's not that they're wrong, or it's just that that's not often all that you need to know about. And that's part of the underpinning rationale for this talk on place and sense of place. So take a look at the Access website if you'd like to know more. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, etc. But it's a team which is diverse in terms of different disciplines, different sectors. People who are based in the nature agencies across the UK are part of our leadership team to ensure that we don't just become too academic in all of this, but we actually think carefully about how to bridge boundaries across sectors, etc. And there's something called the guiding principles that's very important. So our guiding principles kind of take concerns like equality, diversity, and inclusion, or sustainability, and try and provide them as a kind of a blueprint for how we do what we do. So lots of academics fly around to conferences. They do various things which maybe are not very good for the environment itself. And in an environment and climate emergency, we have to look carefully at our own environmental footprint, and the guiding principles set out how to do that. So take a look at that. And we'll return to this in a few minutes when I describe the framework, the net zero sense of place framework, which builds on these guiding principles that I've just mentioned. So that's Access. We'll leave that to the side now, and we'll go to this idea of place. Now, this first quote is useful because it just says, hold on, place is actually not that straightforward. Everybody here, I suppose, knows what the word place is. It's not new to anybody, but it's challenging because it's used both in normal life and it's used as an academic concept and definition in lots of different disciplinary areas. So academics argue over what place means and how it should be defined and how it should be researched. And one of the reasons for its complexity is that it's quite similar to other very important words that we use, like local, like home, like belonging, like community. So there are similarities and differences between each of these, but all of them refer to that kind of local dimension of people's experiences and their lives and their lived experience of the world, and the meaning that certain environments come to have for people in place. So, sorry, in terms of definition, place can be said to be a space that holds meaning. So that word meaning becomes very important. It is a meaningful place to people. What starts as a kind of a space, an undifferentiated space, becomes meaningful, and through relationships, through use, through living, through dwelling, through visiting, and it becomes a place. So that is the kernel of what we mean by place from an academic point of view. It is a meaningful environment that has some kind of importance to people. It's different from other places, and it's something that people care about often and feel connected or rooted within. The other thing to say about this final quote from Cresswell is that place isn't just a thing like London or the university or my house. It's not just a thing in the world, it's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of understanding or knowing the world. And I think that's a really important point to make at the beginning as well. When we see the world in terms of places, we see different kinds of things. And that's what we call a place-sensitive mindset. And I'll be coming back to that in a few minutes' time when I talk about the framework. So we just need to be aware of these different ways of using the idea of place and also what it fundamentally means. So we can break down the complexity of place into three dimensions. Firstly, the kind of spatial, geographical, objective characteristics of it as a location in the world. Here we're talking about real places rather than virtual places, but we can identify them in objective terms a lot of the time. We can also talk about places in terms of them being a locale or a setting for social exchange, social relations, for neighboring encounters of various kinds, different kinds of roles. And finally, and the one that I'll spend most time talking about today, is this idea of sense of place. So this is the less tangible aspects of locations in the world, to do with the emotions, to do with the related identities, to do with the communities that might engage with those places and feel a sense of connection to them. And I'll elaborate on that in the next slide. But just to say at the outset, for those people who might be more oriented towards nature and environment in that sense, people use words like place and landscape to mean different things. Landscape academically is typically referred to something that is a visual entity. It's an environment that you look at. It's an observable thing. Whereas place means something slightly different. It's more about dwelling, experience, connection, rather than something that's aesthetically interesting or observable in that sense. And obviously, landscape is used in more than one way too, and it's used in everyday language as well. So that's complex too. But generally, this is the kernel of a difference between place and landscape that I just wanted to set out from the start. We can come back to it if you want. Now, sense of place too has a number of discrete dimensions to it. And apologies that there's a lot of info to share fairly rapidly on this slide. But sense of place is often used as a kind of umbrella term to describe specific aspects of these less tangible connections between people and environments. And here are some of the key dimensions I thought I would just summarize today. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into these in any great detail, but I just wanted you to be aware of the multiplicity, the diversity and variety of aspects of sense of place before we move on. So the attachment term, place attachment, describes the emotions that people feel towards a particular place. Not always positive. Sometimes people can hate the place where they live or a different place they've had experience of, but it's usually positive. Place identity describes social identities linked to a place. If people describe themselves as I'm a Londoner or I'm British, in some ways they refer to the social identities connected to particular geographies and places in the world. Sense of community, excuse me, sense of community means a variety of things, but when it's related to a community of location or a community of place, it's relevant for understanding sense of place in terms of the other people around and who we are collectively in relation to key places that matter to us. Place satisfaction is about our kind of view of, well, what's the place like? Is it a good place to live or work or visit? Does it have some challenging aspects, some bits that we don't like? Has it changed over time for the better or for the worse? All of that's connected to the idea of satisfaction with the place and the functions that it might have and what it allows us to do or not, as the case may be. Lived experience is pretty clear. It's the kind of the experience you get from being in a place over time. And it's obviously a key prerequisite for acquiring a sense of place, being there, sensing it, experiencing it over time, across seasons, across years. And the accumulation of that leads to lived experience, leads to local knowledge. And that's really important, I think, when it comes to governance and decision-making around change. People who have long-standing relationships with place become experts in that place. And it's a kind of expertise that is often overlooked or perhaps under-recognized. But it can be very important in understanding how places change and recognizing and bringing that expertise into decision-making and governance, as I'll talk about. And then finally, just to draw attention to kind of dimensions which are continually changing in our relationship to place, being inside or outside of a place, what changes and what stays the same. And also these key ideas of displacement and emplacement. So emplacement is kind of describing how we root ourselves in a place over time, how we feel at home there, how we feel connected to it. Whereas displacement describes the opposite. It's processes that happen to actually remove our connections to place, that can leave us feeling displaced or alienated. And some of that is physical. So forced relocation, for whatever reason, it might be environmental disaster, it might be war or conflict. Forcing people to leave their home place and move somewhere else is obviously an example of displacement, but it can be kind of anticipated as well. And that often has come up in my research, where communities living in rural areas directly affected by energy projects, big energy projects, they undergo a process of feeling displaced as a result of the prospective changes that are going to happen to their cherished local areas. And we'll come back to that in terms of what displacement means. But we should be trying to avoid that. We should be trying to encourage emplacement most of the time, and try to avoid and minimize the displacement, which is a profoundly unsettling and anxiety-producing experience that's not good for people's health and well-being. So this introduces us to the kind of landscape of change. Now, places change all the time. They're never fixed. That's kind of one of the key mantras in the human geography literature. But how they change, how much they change, and who controls that change is really important. And this introduces issues of governance, decision-making, but also fairness. Fairness in the process, in terms of how decisions are taken to change places. This could be related to land use planning, for example. Is there engagement? Is it open? Is it transparent? And also the outcomes of those decisions. Are there costs and benefits of the changes that are planned? Who meets them in different ways? Where do the benefits go? And they are constant questions that are always asked when we get to projects that change environments in deliberate, intentional ways. And what we know from the research literature across a long period of time is that disruptive change threatens sense of place. It can also mobilize place protective actions, which was a way that researchers have kind of pivoted around this idea of NIMBYism towards place protective actions. So when the changes proposed are threatening, they undermine sense of place, people can come together sometimes and try and stop that change from happening. And one of the problems we face over the last 10 years is that policy responses to climate change often lead to disruptions. They often lead, they may be in some ways trying to protect places more generally, but in reality, especially energy technology deployment, which is the research area I've been in for a while, the actual deployment process and deficiencies in that often threaten sense of place and can provoke community resistance. And you can see examples of that on the right-hand side, different kinds of examples in different kinds of places. Going back to 2010, the Save Our Valley campaign was a local action group based in Somerset trying to stop the deployment of transmission network grid power lines across a rural area. They were afraid about the erosion of tranquility and naturalness that would come from the imposition, as they felt, of these infrastructures, these industrial infrastructures in areas they felt were incompatible with that, and they collectively tried to respond to that. More recently, I've been involved in a project about very industrial areas, and people can react negatively to propose changes there as well. This was a campaign about the planned use of hydrogen near Liverpool in a place called Ellesmere Port in Whitby in people's homes for heating. And the use of NIMBYism, for example, is a simple way to describe these kinds of no, not here, I don't want it, stop doing this, is really unhelpful, because there's a very consistent underlying pattern across these case studies of people saying, nobody's telling us the truth. We can't trust the information we're given. We're not privy to all of the information. We're not able to contribute to decision making. There are various grounds for injustices that come up again and again and again in those processes, which make us think that it's not just about people being selfish or inward looking or ignorant, but there's something else a lot of the time going on that we need to think through when we think about planning environmental change. So having proceeded through all of that kind of setting out of terms, I just want to talk you through one of my current projects, which is about the decarbonisation of industry. So I'm going to take you to places that probably most people wouldn't ever choose to go on their holidays. These are highly industrialised locations. And you can see from the blobs in the middle picture here that when we think about where CO2 is emitted in the UK, some places are a lot more important than others, because they are places where heavy industry is based. And by heavy industry, I mean oil and gas refineries, places where they create chemical products, where they refine various things. They produce ammonia, they produce fertilizers, all of which creates air pollution and smells and various environmental hazards and CO2 emissions as well. So, a very important part of the journey towards net zero and decarbonisation in the UK is about doing something about these large-scale industrial facilities. Obviously, one of the simple things you could do is just shut them down. But obviously that would have hugely negative consequences socially, economically, and environmentally too, in terms of the people whose jobs and communities rely on these industrial sectors. And also the chances are this industry would simply go to somewhere else in the world where maybe governments were a bit more okay about heavy industry setting up and still putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So we need to do something about these locations, about these industrial locations. And this is a project called Net Zero Sense of Place, which I've been involved in with some colleagues. And it's been in 3 particular locations across the UK. So I'm going to take you to the towns of Milford Haven, Ellesmere Port, and Grangemouth, which is north of Edinburgh. And as I said, these are all locations where heavy industry is based, with huge CO2 footprints, millions of tons of CO2 being emitted from these locations annually. And in this project, we did 3 things. First of all, we conducted interview research with the stakeholders who are promoting plans for industrial decarbonisation in these areas. So these stakeholders consisted of representatives from companies, industry, excuse me, from local councils, public sector partnerships, local economic partnerships, those kinds of organisations. These are the people driving the government-led planning process for these clusters of industries. Secondly, we spoke to local people. We spoke to residents, host communities, we described them, and we asked them about their perspective on these plans to deploy technologies like hydrogen or carbon capture and undersea or underground storage. And thirdly, we integrated these different voices in multi-stakeholder workshops. We brought them together to confront the different ideas they have and to try and bring these different views and visions of the future together. And out of that work, sensitive to place, we created a framework which I'm going to show you in the next slide. But before I do that, I suppose, I just want to tell you a little bit about the stakeholder perspective. So as I said, we interviewed the stakeholders and we asked them, you know, what do you think the 2050 is going to bring to these places? What do you think they're going to look like? And they just kept talking about technologies. Generally, they talked about those key decarbonisation technologies. They didn't tend to talk about place. They didn't tend to talk about communities very much. And when place was talked about at all, it was often in a kind of a marketing sense. It was reduced to branding as a tool, an instrumental tool for bringing inward investment into these economic locations. So Community engagement was fragmented, it was limited, and it was also really very instrumental. It was only done if it was needed to be done to achieve a certain kind of technology goal, rather than something that's important in and of itself, maybe from a normative or ethical point of view, because these are the people who are going to have to live with these really quite speculative technologies in some senses, in the sense that they haven't been deployed at scale in many places in the world as yet. And the outcome is that local residents really feel both impacted, but largely left behind by this industrial decarbonisation process. And that's not a recipe for successful structural transformations to our economy or to our society. We have to find ways of bringing host communities and local people with us on that journey. Here are a few quotes from local people. Take a little look. These are their own words. So you can see here that it's not that people don't like industry. You know, these residents have often lived here for generations. Industry is part of the community. It's part of their blood in a sense. They want to feel a sense of pride in industrial places, but they're finding this very, very hard because over the last 20 to 30 years, they've seen a systematic erosion in the industry contribution to host communities. They remember the 1970s and 80s when the industry and companies like ICI, for example, or BP, were the heart of the community in terms of funding and provision of services and amenities. And that's all been seen to be gone now. So they're looking for a rebalancing of relationships, for an increase in trust. They're looking for clarity and honesty in these plans. And they also want to see local benefit from these kinds of technology deployments, given really harsh, often economic deprivations, food poverty, food banks in these areas. So it's great to talk about, you know, industrial clusters that will reach net zero by 2035 with hundreds of billions of pounds worth of government and private investment. But what does that mean for people struggling to make a living in these places who are not by any means convinced that new jobs will go to them and their families and to their neighbours? So this is what the net zero sense of place framework looks like. And it was our attempt to distill our findings into a simple infographic that would be actionable by people on the ground. It's our attempt, I suppose, to try and move away from a very technology-centered perspective on net zero, which we feel is currently the case, and maybe give back something useful for people if they want to think about sense of place. What might it look like? So you can see that this figure on the right has got kind of multiple components to it, which I'll describe over the next 5 minutes or so. At the center is the place-sensitive mindset. Around that are 6 aspects of sense of place, some of which I've talked about already very briefly. Then it's got an array of benefits that we see from pursuing this approach for different sectors, for residents and host communities, for government at different scales, and for industry players involved in net zero. And then you can see that underlying triangle, those 3 dimensions that are kind of overarching principles, and that comes back to the Access project I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll describe in a moment. So we think this can be a kind of a blueprint which could enable engagement between communities and stakeholders in a way that could lead to more inclusive and fair technology deployment. But we have to say there's a caveat here as well. This isn't a simple tool that can be used to kind of switch on community acceptance or achieve consensus. It won't be easy to do any of those things. It takes sustained engagement over time and sometimes living with difference, recognizing differences of view. So consensus isn't necessarily the aspiration for anybody in this, in engagement, genuine engagement, and it's also difficult to achieve. So I'll just very briefly, before I finish, describe these key components and then generate a conclusion. So coming back to that, place-sensitive mindset at the center. And it comes back to that initial idea that when we think with place, we see the world differently. We don't just see it as facts and figures, as numbers or technologies in the abstract, but we see it in terms of people, place, connections, the emotions, the experiences that I mentioned. We see worlds of meaning and experience. And for me, this is really key to net zero. Often the language and the discourse around net zero is technological in a way that isn't really clear where people fit into that journey. look at the cover of the government's net zero strategy from a couple of years ago. Offshore wind farms, great, but where are communities in this? Where is society in that? It's not too clear. I much prefer the bottom figure, which comes from one of our resident workshops. And you've got a man holding up a picture of what Ellesmere Port used to look like, a kind of a postcard of better days in the 1980s and 90s. So these are local people talking about their own place in terms of net zero. And for me, that's a much more productive way of understanding and preparing for the rapid changes that we need, which is people-centered as much as technology-centered in terms of reducing emissions fast and effectively. So we need to adopt this place-sensitive mindset. I'm not saying we need to throw out other ways of thinking about net zero or environments or nature, but we need to complement that kind of perspective of facts and figures with a place-sensitive mindset too. It's an essential thing, I think, for moving forward in an effective way. So that's a place-sensitive mindset. And then if we think about the base of the triangle, we've got these three dimensions of meaningful engagement. And as I said, what we've found is that communities do not feel engaged with. They feel overlooked largely through, and if they're engaged with, it's very instrumental. So we need to find spaces to bring people together and allow people to make their voices heard. And that needs to be done in an inclusive way that respects people's points of view and respects the different knowledges they bring to the table. We need to think about that inclusively in terms of EDI, diversity, making sure that it's not just the usual suspects who turn up to meetings, but people who represent communities in all of their different facets and dimensions. And we also need to think about the sustainability of everything we do. So if you're planning engagement, think through where you have it, what kind of building it's in, what kind of food is catered, how people might travel there. We need to reduce the impacts of engagement on all of our activities, including academic research. So, and these are guiding principles that you'll find out more about by going to the Access website. And then there are the key 6 place themes that I've mentioned, and I'll just talk through these very briefly and then finish. So it's about encouraging pride in place, that sense of positive connection, that people are happy about where they live and where they come from. They're pleased to tell people, I'm from Grangemouth, I'm from Milford Haven and other places like that. So if we're planning changes to the environment, how do we do that in a way which doesn't reduce pride or attachments, but actually elevates those and strengthens those? That's always an underpinning question around projects and change. But we also need to recognize that places have changed and will continue to change. And we need to have a kind of a time dimension. Often in energy projects that I study, it's as if the place has just come into being and the history, the experiences, the memories don't exist a lot of the time. They're ignored. So we need to be aware of changes over time and how the history and memories figure into people's expectations of the future. We need to ground benefits in local communities so that people do not feel that there's an unfairness in where benefits are distributed. We need to unlock local knowledge, which I mentioned is the cumulative experience that people have. They know how the local area works in ways that people from outside, like myself, simply won't know. So we need to tap into that, find ways of eliciting that local knowledge in a way that's fair. Place visioning is an exercise in thinking collectively. What should this place look like? How could it be in 2050? So if we think about Grangemouth and net zero and 2050, we've got to think about all aspects of the place: healthcare, air quality, schooling, transport facilities. All of that is there. We can't just think about it in terms of hydrogen or emissions. It's got to be a package of multidimensional things, which is what place offers. And then finally, it's about trust and reciprocity. I mentioned the sense of imbalance that communities feel they're being extracted from or done to, and there's a lack of trust as a result. Now, trust is very difficult to rebuild, but it can start with a meaningful and genuine engagement and an attempt to listen to people's concerns and give voice to that and be prepared to act on it. So all of that can produce lots of benefits. It can address and rebuild trust between residents, government, and industry. It can rebalance relationships, encourage pride, etc., etc. We need to go through this process because We won't get buy-in to long-term 2050 policy goals unless the steps we take now are done in a meaningfully engaged way. So we need to build that societal consent through small steps in places over time, and that's really important. So just to finish up, the idea is that these kinds of frameworks based on research evidence can help to connect academic research on the one hand with people in the real world on the other. We can't have a separation between those two worlds. The real world needs evidence, and academics need to be able to share it and need to be prepared to do that. And this has never been more urgent than in a time of environment and climate emergency. Now, it's our belief that concepts like place help us to see the world differently and to better understand change and people's responses to change and the kind of anxieties and threats that it can bring. By adopting a place-sensitive mindset, by using it to inform and create more effective engagement, we can better connect people and nature, rebuild trust, and enable more fair and inclusive deployment of the technologies that are needed in order to achieve policy goals like net zero. So there are the different dimensions of that framework. I hope that's been useful, and you can find out more. All of this information is available on the IDRIC project website, which I mentioned. So if anybody's interested, we're holding a webinar for policymakers and practitioners at the beginning of December, where we'll be talking about an extension of this work in more detail. And I would just finish by saying thank you very much for listening, and any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And if you get a chance to go through the chat later, you'll see that lots of people are saying, oh, it's fantastic, so useful, really great to kind of see these connections between projects and communities. So yeah, really exciting. And so I'm going to go into the Q&A to take questions from there. If anyone has any questions you want me to put to Patrick, please use the Q&A and I can get them out of there. So a first question is, how do we help people, and that might be the public, I use in inverted commas, governments or organisations, to help realise greater social networks and capital as part of climate adaptation, as well as the techno fixes that you mentioned? So I suppose that's not just mitigation, it's thinking we are going to have to change place as well to adapt to things.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we have just a deep-seated underlying problem that we tend to think about things and act on things in silos. We're specialized. We have specialization. So I've talked almost exclusively about mitigation today, about technologies for decarbonization. But for example, the academic research literature talks about projects, for example, that have put in engineering solutions for flooding, for example, for sea flood defenses, and how that action has often provoked a sense of disruption to place, threatened people's sense of place, and they've tried to stop it. So the underpinning lessons to this framework about how we go about changing local places and how we build that process in ways which is socially inclusive is absolutely as relevant for adaptation as it is for mitigation. So I totally agree. We need to join these things up. We need to join these kind of concerns with adaptation and mitigation. And we also need to join up the economic dimension, the technological dimension, the environmental dimension, the social dimension, etc. We need to glue those together in kind of more holistic frameworks. And actually academics sometimes are really not very helpful with that, because we're trained to be specialists. We're extremely good at a very narrow slice of actions. We always need to be humble about the fact that we don't know it all and there's an awful lot else going on.
Absolutely. In fact, there's another question directly following on from that, recognising that technical communities like scientific computing need to link with social scientists to help make changes towards net zero. But the question is, how do we encourage that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question. I've long felt that the way we teach engineers needs to change. So there needs to be some social science embedded in engineering courses. It's not that we need to create somebody who knows everything. That's not possible. But we need to make sure that social scientists, for example, understand technologies or understand nature. 20 years ago, I didn't know what a battery was in terms of, or a smart meter, or what flexibility and energy demand means. So I've had to become I wouldn't say an expert in energy issues, but at least to have a rudimentary knowledge of technologies. So we do need to have I guess, more all-round education. And we also need to enable academics and experts to communicate and to recognize diversities of knowledge. And I think that the IPCC that was mentioned at the beginning, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, specifically around adaptation, is to some extent leading the way here in recognizing the value of indigenous knowledge, lay knowledge, local knowledges, traditional knowledges. It isn't just about the experts. And I think that's a really important part to consider. And that's why listening to local people is really important, but they're often not considered to be experts. And that's part of the problem, that they don't feel listened to or appreciated or respected.
Yeah, fantastic. And a follow-on question from there then is, so Christine is saying that many Indigenous people's sense of place is what is so critical and makes them such great guardians of their land biodiversity. And so a follow-on question is, have you interviewed displaced individuals and how this framework might work for migrant or diaspora communities?
Good question. I mean, I think, as I said in the start, displacement doesn't need to be physical to be real. It can be mental, it can be psychological, it can be felt. So I think all of my projects have involved encounters with people who are still in a place, but they're contemplating leaving, and they feel a profound sense of displacement from the changes that they feel are being pushed on them by government or by technology companies. But in terms of my direct research experience, no, I don't think I have, because I've been working on the mitigation side of technology deployment. But I know that lots of other academics have been using the place lens to understand displacement coming from, say, forced relocation around climate adaptation. And of course, the loss of that cultural experience is absolutely dreadful and disastrous. So it is being picked up. It is informing climate policy through the IPCC and Working Group 2 on climate adaptation. And these concepts are informing that. Yeah, that's probably all I can say now.
Excellent, thank you. So you mentioned in the talk kind of balancing social, environmental, economic concerns and so on. A question is about, how do we balance what a place means for people with what it means to nature and the animals that live there? So that sort of environmental human balance. So for instance, changes which benefit species and habitats in the ocean but will result in restrictions imposed on human activity.
Yeah. This is a really good question. And I was kind of expecting somebody to ask this, because I think that in some senses, you know, I come from a social science background. My training is in psychology. So I see the world in terms of people's experiences of that world. But I'm absolutely aware that there's more to place than sense of place. There's more to place than people's relationships with it. There's the whole biophysical, ecological dimensions of it. And that has a value in its own right. So I don't want to place too much importance on the people dimension of place and to be too kind of anthropocentric around these concerns. But I do think that if we're going to get acceptable change or inclusive change to places, for example, and those changes might be designating areas to be left to nature, to be left to wild or rewild, etc., however you term that. At some stage, we have to talk to people about those changes. We have to bring people with us, and that's the kind of the side of the argument that I'm in. But I absolutely recognize that there is a value and a kind of a validity to nature and the environment that's completely outside of our own emotions and concerns with it, and that is fundamental to understanding place as well. So I would endorse that and just say that it's a very important part. But I guess what I'm trying to do here is to think about, well, how do we bring government or institutions or processes of change and decision making with us around those changes, so that we can hang on to those treasured environments and make sure that it isn't only about what people want, but it's about what's good for the environment more generally as well.
Fantastic. So 2 final questions, then we'll have to wrap up. So one was, please could you move the slides to the webinar so people could see that again, so they can kind of get to that QR code. Fantastic. And then just finally wrapping up here, as we're very at our time. So thinking of that temporal dimension, so time and perhaps childhood and children. So is there a place for children and, you know, that fleeting period in our lives of when you have a very different experience of the world in the framework?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, children are just as much residents of a place as anyone else. I guess we've principally been thinking about, workers, residents, adults through our research, but absolutely. I mean, in a sense, we're doing this because of children, because of future generations, and we have to bring them with us. I guess the challenge then is just to find modes and mechanisms of engagement which are appropriate for different kinds of people across a community. And children are absolutely part of that. Teenagers are part of that too. So the kinds of events that we organized here through our multi-stakeholder workshops, where we get people to sit around a table and to fill in post-it notes and annotate maps, fine, might not work with primary school children or secondary school kids, but that's absolutely it, because we're trying to take communities with us here in all of their different diversities. So that I would see that as underneath that bracket of genuine and meaningful engagement. And I think there's an issue there about the skills needed to do that, and the issue of trust. So in some of the places we did this research in, local bodies wanted to do this kind of engagement with communities, but people weren't turning up because they didn't trust the people organizing the meetings. So there are lots of issues there. But anyway, yes, absolutely. I think children are an important part of this, and it's their futures we're talking about. And we want to hang on to those people. We want them to stay in these places and to live there for future generations, not leave because they're being done to. So absolutely vital part and voice to be shared as well.
Wonderful. And that is a fantastic note to end on there. Thank you so much for the seminar. And I hope people will connect through with your research and into the webinar. For everyone in the session, there's lots of comments and notes and question connections within the chat. So please do use those as well. And thank you very much for this year's Communicate.